Star Wars only, I don't know what the fuck your problem is.
Well, now that we're done with the sequel trilogy, we finally concluded the Skywalker Saga story that began with A New Hope in 1977, but chronologically began in 1999 with The Phantom Menace. That's where the story started, and it ended in 2019. I think now, though, with hindsight and history to look at now, we can kind of say, or at least people like me would say, I think George Lucas probably should have done the sequel trilogy. And it's not a diss to the sequel trilogy that we have now. I mean, I'll admit, I don't like them. I thought The Force Awakens was solid, but both the films after that just really did not make the mark for me and did not feel like a proper conclusion to the story of Star Wars. And it didn't feel new, it didn't feel innovative, it didn't feel like a story worth telling. But I think, personally, that George Lucas may have been the guy to do it. And he sold the franchise in 2012, and we know, well, at least I know, I don't know about you guys, but I know that in 2011, and even a little bit prior, he was planning on making his own sequel trilogy. He approached Mark Hamill, Carrie Fisher, Harrison Ford to come back and reprise their roles. He had begun writing story treatments. We know that he wrote story treatments for the 7, 8, 9 films. And Michael Arndt, who was one of the writers for Episode 7, even though he was kind of removed from the project early on, he was supposed to write the screenplay for the sequel trilogy. And he had about 40 to 50 pages of it, but apparently from the people at Lucasfilm, they say that he couldn't really just get it going and get it flowing the way they would want it to be done. I think that's unfortunate. I think it would have been more interesting to have Lucas do what he did, write the story outline, write the story treatments for the sequel trilogy, and then have someone like Michael Arndt, have a co-writer come in and write the screenplay. Because Lucas, if you know anything about Lucas, and I know a lot of Star Wars fans pretend to think they do, but they really don't, Lucas is not a good writer. I mean, just as simple as that. He's not a good writer. He does not like writing. Francis Ford Coppola, his mentor in the film industry, basically told him, if you wanted to learn how to direct a movie, you need to at least learn how to write it. You know, just write it all in one go. Don't go back and rewrite and try to fix it and make it perfect. Just write it, get it done. And Lucas will admit he's not the best writer in the world. And watching the prequel trilogy, I don't care if you like them or not, you can tell they're not great written movies. But that's okay, because now we can look at the sequel trilogy and say, well, if George Lucas was going to approach this in the right way, he can do what he did with the original trilogy. He can write the story, bring someone else in to co-write the story, and then someone else to write the screenplay, and that could have been Michael Arndt. But I think what would have been more interesting with George Lucas and his sequel trilogy is the exploration of the Force and delving into the Force a little bit. Now that we've seen the sequel trilogy, it didn't really do anything unique with the Force. George Lucas has revealed in a James Cameron interview with AMC that his Star Wars sequel trilogy, it would have been about the midichlorians. And while I'm not a fan of the idea of the midichlorians, I think one of the reasons that is because it's not explored properly. He also talks about exploring more about the Wills, and he even says that fans would have hated the films like they did The Phantom Menace. And sure, maybe we would have. Maybe it wouldn't have been as great as we all would like to think it would be, and that may be true. Maybe he would have brought in a bad director or a bad writer, or maybe just the story that he wrote was not good enough for the Star Wars films that we would want. But he still would have finished the story in a sense of the way that he would have wanted it to be done. And also, there is something to be said about George Lucas being involved with Star Wars in the sense of he is a very creative man. I will criticize the man till the day I die for the mistakes he made. I know a lot of people act like he is a god and can do no wrong now, but no, he has made mistakes, and I will call a spade and tell him when he's done wrong. But I'm also going to tell you what there is good about the man, and one of the great things about him is that he's a very creative person when it comes to story and thinking up of story ideas. But he does a lot better when he has someone execute those ideas, write and direct those films. You look at Empire Strikes Back, you look at Return of the Jedi, and even kind of A New Hope in a way. He has a lot of creative talent around him that helps him thrive and challenges him properly, and that's when George Lucas is at his best. So when it comes to the sequel trilogy, if it's about the microbiotic universe, it's about the Wills and exploring the Force and how the Wills control the Force, and how he says we're basically like cars. The people in the universe that control and use the Force, they're like cars for the Wills. The Wills are what really use and dictate what happens with the Force. That's interesting. I mean, it's just a few sentences of story ideas that I would love to explore and love to see. And I would have much preferred to explore that route of Star Wars and that story than just basically redo what we already did with the original trilogy and make the original trilogy characters not as important or flawed in more ways than one. It just, for me, the sequel trilogy is disappointing. And I know with characters like Luke Skywalker, he would have died off in Episode 9 of George Lucas's sequel trilogy. And we also would have had Leia being a Force user. And the story would have focused around teenagers, not children. I think that's one big mistake with The Phantom Menace, was that we had a 9-year-old boy as the main character, or supposed to be the main character. I mean, I was very young when I saw that film, and I still didn't like it. And even now, in hindsight, it's got its flaws. But I think exploring teenagers, having that coming-of-age story that Lucas really likes to do when it comes to Star Wars, would relate to a lot of younger audiences, and might have worked, honestly. And we would have had a sidekick to Luke Skywalker. His apprentice would have been called a Kira. You have a lot of different story outlines. The Jedi temples would have been bells, I know that for sure. There's so many different aspects to George Lucas's sequel trilogy that I think would have been a lot more interesting. And I'm pretty confident Palpatine would still be dead, but I do remember hearing something about how he might have returned in Episode 9. But there's also a lot of drafts that Lucas wrote for the entire Star Wars story that would have gone beyond Return of the Jedi in 7, 8, 9. Honestly, basically up until the prequel trilogy happened, George Lucas said he was going to do Episodes 7, 8, and 9 after he was done with the prequel trilogy. But after the backlash that those films got, and to be honest, I mean, Star Wars had money, but enough money to make an entire new trilogy of films might have been a stretch, and Lucas wasn't in the right state of mind to do more films when Disney approached him, because Red Tails wasn't doing so well. A lot of the films that he was producing weren't, box office hits, and people will blame the fans and say, oh, they slandered the man and criticized him nonstop. Well, yeah, you're right. He did get a lot of hate at the time, and some of it was well-deserved, but a lot of it was way overreacting. I mean, the whole George Lucas raped our childhood stuff, they definitely went too far in a few places there. But George said when he saw the screening of The Force Awakens that it wasn't new, it wasn't innovative, there's nothing new to see, and I think that really speaks volume to what he would have done with the sequel trilogy. He would have done a new story. And yes, we would have the original trilogy characters, but I don't think it would make them the center focus of the film. I think they would have been what they should have been in the sequel trilogy, which is kind of the background characters that provide a little bit of guidance and a little bit of backstory to what happened, and let the new characters go fulfill their destiny and explore that world and explore Star Wars. But George is an innovative filmmaker. He likes to change things up with the film industry every time he makes the Star Wars trilogy. I really wonder how he would have innovated things a third time around. You know how hard that is to do? And I mean, to be fair, he didn't really create the camera system that blew up after A New Hope came out. But when it came to special effects, the original trilogy revolutionized special effects. It changed everything. I mean, a lot of people look at the original trilogy now and like, oh, it's cool, but there's this flaw and whatnot. But people really don't understand. When people saw the original trilogy in the 70s and the 80s, their life was changed. I mean, you went into that film and there was no other film like Star Wars. Literally no other film like Star Wars. Now there's so many other films like Star Wars that do franchises and big boom booms and CGI and messages of whatnot. I mean, it's crazy what we can do now. But none of them tell the story that Star Wars told. And the prequel trilogy had the innovation of digital technology, using characters like Jar Jar Binks, who you never really had a character who was used by Ahmed Best. He was played by Ahmed Best, but they actually put a digital version of him in the film and made that Jar Jar Binks, and then using digital cameras in Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith, which I don't think was the best choice in the world, but still, in hindsight, it did revolutionize how we make films nowadays. It did let us use digital technology that changes modern day filmmaking. How would George have done it a third time around? I mean, I really would like to know. And the sequel trilogy that he made would have been more experimental, would have been different. It wouldn't have been a blockbuster film like we have with the sequel trilogy now. That's one thing that's great about George Lucas, is he's not the Hollywood studio kind of director. He hated that. There's a legend that, I'm not sure how accurate it is, but the day he got onto set on one of the studio lots was the day the last real big studio head retired. Like the same day Lucas started his job there. The last of a dying breed in the studio world basically quit. So this man's life has been something truly remarkable and undeniably spellbinding, just looking back at it. And I really wish we could have seen what he had to offer with the sequel trilogy. And maybe they couldn't have used his story treatments for episodes 7, 8, 9, but I think that it would have been a story that he told and that he finished the way he wanted to do it. And I know people like to think that Lucas basically wrote Star Wars and had it all planned out. He didn't, but I also think that it would have been better planned out if he had made the sequel trilogy and if he had more collaboration on it. Because when you look at the prequels, I don't care what you think about them, they're nothing compared to the original trilogy. And the original trilogy thrives on collaboration with people like Lucas and Leah Brackett and Lawrence Kasdan and Gary Kurtz and even Richard Marquand. I would have preferred seeing George collaborate with more people in the sequel trilogy, like Michael Arden, and maybe even have J.J. Abrams direct. I wouldn't have minded him directing the film, just have a problem with him writing it, honestly. I wouldn't have minded something like that. But it's one of those things where you just look at it like an alternate reality. Maybe one day we can get Lucas in an interview, lock him down in a room and say, you are not leaving here until you tell me exactly how your sequel trilogy would have gone. Maybe he can write a book about it. I don't know, but I do miss the man, and I do love the man. He's been the influence for me to get into film school. Studying his life has been inspiring, and just seeing what one man can create. One awkward child from Modesto, this nerd who was obsessed with comic books and Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers serials, and just was into film, not even into sci-fi fantasy film. He didn't want to make a sci-fi movie. He was into documentary making. He was into experimental projects and films outside the realm of normality. How he created this grand saga that spanned 40 plus years and will still be going into the future. And it's pretty depressing to think that we don't get to see his vision all the way through. But hey, that's how life works, my friends. You don't always get what you want. But tell me your thoughts below. What do you guys think about George Lucas finishing the sequel trilogy the way he would have wanted to do it? Are you content with the episodes 7, 8, and 9 we got now, or would you have liked to explore the microbiotic universe of the midichlorians and the Wills? A lot of possibilities there. Tell me your thoughts below. I'm Star Wars Only. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. I will see you all next time, and may the Force be with you always.